Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another episode for Film Fanatic. So today is gonna be the stunning conclusion to my epic coverage of this 15 movie disc set compilation that I got at Opera House Video. I've covered just about every movie. There were a few movies on here that I did not cover, only because I've covered them before in other videos last year or this year. I and also some of these other films that I did not do a show on. I already have copies of some on Blu-ray, some on DVD. So, but most of these films on here, I had it was my first time seeing any of them. So it's been a pretty epic journey in discovering a whole bunch of these really super low budget, pretty obscure, from what I gather, Italian movies from mostly from the '60s. The thing that's been really cool and it's always a big surprise to me is, with that being said, like most of these films I had never heard of before, and they seem to be pretty obscure Italian films. I've been pretty surprised and kind of excited and blown away by the amount of people that have responded to a lot of these videos. And I usually, when I do a show on Film Fanatic, I usually upload the video, I record the video, then I upload it, and I usually upload it to, well, I always upload it to my personal page, and then also to the Film Fanatic page on Facebook. And then I usually do a post where I review the film too, where I'll use like a photo and write a little review on the film, and I usually share those to also Film Fanatic Facebook, my Instagram page, Main at Film Fanatic, and then a couple other groups that I'm a member of on Facebook that specialize in grindhouse movies. So, and I've been really super stoked on how, again, it's one of those things. These movies that are, at least that I think, they're super obscure. Nobody has seen them, or nobody watches them, or has an interest in them. But then I get this feedback from people that are really into these films, and super cool. And that's the I cover all kinds of stuff, and I try to always mix things up. But to me, that's always the primary focus of this channel is putting bringing some of these movies and my favorite style of filmmaking, into the light maybe a little bit. So yeah, so today is going to be the last show on this collection, and the last movie, and so super excited. And I don't know, this movie, The Ghost, which again is a movie I've never seen, never heard about. You know, there's that saying of saving the best for last, and this movie is pretty amazing. I was kind of blown away by it. It was a little bit hard to get through, only because the transfer of this film on DVD is pretty rough, to say the least. There's a couple of segments in the movie where you can't really see what's going on because of the really bad quality. It's one of the worst ones, unfortunately, on this disc or on this collection. But the movie, it was so damn good that I was hooked. And and again, it was a film I've never seen before. It came out in 1963. It's called The Ghost. It's an Italian movie. It was directed by Riccardo Freda. And what a great movie this is. The movie's basically centered on this woman who is having an affair, and her husband is in a wheelchair, and he is kind of a miserable person. He's not very happy. He's almost to the point of where he doesn't really want to live anymore. But he's sitting on a pretty, big. He's part of this big estate. He's worth lots of money, and so they both end up having this, you know, plot to basically murder this this guy who is her husband. And this movie, like the title says, it is like such a great classic ghost story. And the whole story is centered on her basically where she feels that she's being haunted by his ghost after he dies. And but that being said, it has such an interesting twist to it because without giving anything away, it's not your typical ghost story. It definitely has those tropes, great atmosphere. You know, the locations that they shot this film is just really great. It takes place in this really creepy old house. The cinematography is really cool. The music is really great. But it has, it's kind of a murder mystery. It really reminds me of a giallo film. You know, I love the giallo style. Of course, giallo is exclusively like an Italian art form, and the giallo thing is really the Italian's version of kind of the Agatha Christie story, the murder mystery format, but told through, uh, you know, in only a way the Italians could could explore. You know, usually those the one of the difference. Well, there's quite a few differences between the say the classic Agatha Christie, the British genre, the murder mystery style, and then also the Italian style, where you have, you know, the classic British style is there's a series of murders or there's a murder and then there is a series of where there are all these characters that are involved and that they're related to the case, but then there's some kind of, you know, to a degree, an investigation going on through the law enforcement, through the family, through the friends, through the people involved in the story. And it's kind of a slow burn, but there's like a murder mystery where they try to pick up these clues and try to find out who is responsible for those murders. And there's always a level of really cool suspense and a cool sense of having to really guess as to who is the at the end of the day the murderer. One of the best kind of modern versions of that kind of classic genre is I feel is like Knives, a movie that came out a few years ago, Knives Out. Incredible film starring Daniel Craig and Jamie Lee Curtis. The and I feel like that's a very modern kind of contemporary version of that classic format. With the giallo style, it's very different because obviously the style is similar. Like the setup is basically the same, but the giallo style is different in a way because there tends to be a little bit more of a taboo, you know, where they explore maybe some more taboos. Where there's always a lot of the times there's always some kind of sexual or psychosexual element. There is also usually there tends to be more violence in the giallo. There tends to be more of a sleazy kind of element around the sex. So it has a little bit more of a graphic nature, and it seems to dive a little bit deeper into this psychology of what's going on around the killer. They tend to be a little bit more graphic. You have those typical tropes of where there's always the gloved killer. They tend to be more violent and a little bit more graphic, and they tend to have elements of horror. So stylistically, they're very very different. And also the giallo thing has the giallo style, the way the Italians would shoot a lot of their films, they tend to be almost like a heightened reality where there's a lot of, you know, interesting and wild colors. The cinematography is very powerful, almost like where it acts like its own character on screen. Classic example of the giallo, probably arguably the best giallo movie ever made, and at least that I've seen, is a film called Torso by Sergio Martino. just an amazing film, and it's really graphic and just but it's just got this real intense murder mystery, crime caper aesthetic, and such a great film. So this movie definitely has. I wouldn't say that this film, The Ghost, is a full-on giallo, but it definitely has, especially without giving anything away. It definitely has that characteristic, or some of those characteristics. And so it's interesting seeing that kind of influence, or seeing that style blended in with like your classic kind of ghost story film. I haven't really seen that kind of style. That's one thing I really love about these Italian movies is, and why I love Italian cinema so much, and especially the exploitation cinema, is a lot of these directors were not afraid to like take chances, even though they didn't have a lot of money and the luxury of being backed by a major studio. They were into lots of different things, and they would they'd have interest in, obviously, horror, the giallo style, the action genre, the western genre, the surrealist films, and they would and comedy, and they would just kind of blend sex exploitation. They would just kind of blend all of these things together a lot of the time. So a lot of the times that I see is your typical thing. If you say pick an Italian movie that's a horror film, a lot of the times it has other elements to it, of where it has other qualities that are not necessarily typically part of that genre. And I think that's a really interesting kind of a thing. And I feel like a lot of these directors, like Lucio Fulci, my favorite Italian director, they were not afraid to take chances, and they were throwing lots of different things. Jess Franco, one of my favorite directors from Spain, they would blend all these styles together. But you could label, obviously, you would label some of their films as a specific genre type, but they would pull elements from lots of different things. Where a lot of the times, like say an American horror film, like a film say by John Carpenter or Tobe Hooper, amazing directors, some of my favorite directors, but they would, you know, their style or their films were more or less, kind of genre specific. You're not going to necessarily see an amalgamation or the influence of multiple genres in that film. It's going to be, you're going to get a good horror film, or you're going to get, a great science fiction film or whatnot. It's going to have those tropes, and it's going to be unique and great, but it's not going to blend non genre specific things. And I feel like that's a really cool trait that I've noticed with a lot of the Italian directors. And this movie's awesome. Like, the ending is just fantastic. It's pretty gory. There's one scene in particular where there's a person who, without giving away anything, there's a razor blade scene, which is another thing of that you see in a lot of giallo films. Like I said, a lot of giallo films have the classic trope of where there's like the mass killer, or the killer where he's wearing these gloves and he's using these like straight razors to kill people. And there's a scene in this film where a straight razor is used, and there's this murderous scene that's really graphic and bloody as all hell. And I did not expect it, because up until that point the film isn't necessarily very violent or very gory, but this one scene is kind of shocking, and it kind of comes out of nowhere. And to me, it was like, oh wow, something right out of a Sergio Martino film. It was like really graphic and just really kind of intense. And again, to think that how that this film came out when it did in 1963 is just wild. A lot of these films are just so, I find, are so ahead of their time because of you know the things that they would show. Quite honestly, with as far as the graphic nature of things, some of the taboo subjects. And again, I have never Ricardo Fredo, I don't believe I've seen any of his films before, but very very cool. He also a bunch of he's he was a pretty uh, prolific director. These all of these directors. Which the other thing I'm just amazed about is how prolific so many of these Italian directors were. Um, he did a whole series of films: The Vampires in 1967, The Horrible Doctor Hitchcock in '62, Theodora's Slave Empress in '54. I mean, it's just crazy. Cat Key the Immortal 1959, Double Face in '69 with Klaus Kinski. Wow, wild. Murder Syndrome in '81. I mean, just super cool. And again, so when I, in my travels, when I'm out looking for, all things exploitation, these are like some extra directors I'll be, thinking about, inquiring about, looking for their titles. Super cool. Just such a cool way of discovering all of these new fabulous films and fabulous directors. And also, being that this collection, this is the last movie in this collection for the show for Film Fanatic. Being that the obvious thing where the quality isn't very very good on most of these films. Some of the films it was pretty good, but overall definitely worth having and definitely worth buying. Very much looking forward to buying these films on Blu-ray if I come across them. So and again, you just never know. I'm always blown away by what movies are being re-released, especially the last couple of years through all of these, bo- b- beautiful boutique companies, like Vinegar Syndrome, Mondo Macabra, Blue Underground, where Severin, where they're just, they're putting out, they specialize in all of these movies, and it's astounding that you can pick or find the most obscure, low budget trash movie, and it gets this like royal treatment, in 4K or Blu-ray, and it's just like mind-boggling. One of my all-time favorite movies. I was so blown away by it. Private Parts. I one of my all-time favorite movies. Super obscure movie, super hard to find. And when I found that on Blu-ray, I was just like blown away. I was so excited, and I love that movie to death. And so that's just an example of some of the titles that you'll find, you know, that with all of these great re-releases. It's astounding, and that I think as the genre as a whole, I think these re-releases kind of give these directors and actors and actresses that were in these movies that probably at one point, probably most of the time, are they were forgotten about. They had maybe a good initial release, or they had some attraction when they first came out, but then they just went into total obscurity. And some films never even got that far. And to see what I've seen in a lot of these special editions of a lot of these classic movies that I bought over the years is, a lot of these directors now have, to a degree, a second career. Like, they're actually making a little bit of money, and they're kind of being remembered now and honored for some of their great films. And I just think that's awesome. It's kind of given a lot of these great films a second life. And to me, that's the coolest thing, because, in on full intents and purposes, or and an overall thing, I think you could say, it's safe to say, is that this is these decades are part of a bygone era. Like, movies like this just don't get made anymore. There's obviously newer horror films. There's a whole been the whole explosion of a lot of the shot on video films that have come out that are new, and those are fantastic. And they obviously are very much influenced by the exploitation world, and I consider them to be modern exploitation films in a lot of ways. Tremendously influenced by a lot of those films from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And and there's a few other films that come out every year that obviously have that kind of aesthetic. But as a whole, the genre itself is kind of dead, and nothing like that comes out anymore. So it's, it's part of a golden period and a golden era. I just think it's fantastic. One of the things that was interesting was I one of my favorite YouTube guys, Mood616, who is a Canadian YouTube guy who is does all kind. He does coverage of all kinds of movies, all kinds of genres, but his main thing is the world of exploitation. And I'm a huge fan. He's my favorite guy overall. And I have come across and learned about a lot of these films and directors, and then also have like revisited tons of movies from my youth when I was a kid when I first saw them, and it's kind of brought me back to the table to see these movies again. But just an amazing channel. And he does these shows of where he'll have other people on the channel, and they're long shows, and they'll basically pick a decade, and they'll each person who's on the show will do, their top 10 lists, say, of 1979 or 1980 in like the horror exploitation world. And it's really cool. I've been watching and listening to some of those videos. And one of the interesting things that kind of occurred to me about it was like they were talking about, a few pretty low budget exploitation movies, and and they were picking them apart and kind of being critical. And one of the things that kind of occurred to me was I find when when I'm watching a lot of these films and into them, and obviously there's good and bad in every genre. There are other films that are probably better in a lot of ways, but I kind of find it hard to be uber critical of a lot of these films because typically a lot of these movies already have, maybe not the best acting, maybe not the greatest writing or editing or even direction to a degree, but they just have this amazing atmosphere. And if you took those kinds of things and say, and transferred it to say quote unquote highbrow movie or a big budget movie, those little faults that are, and those little cracks, if those were in that, more heavily financed style of filmmaking, the film, I think, would just not work and it would just be a failure. But with the exploitation world, most of the time, from what I see, is that all of those things that are technically the mistakes, if you will, overall kind of work in that format and make the film what it is, and and for me, it gives me that appeal as to why I love these films, because they're so raw and they have those things, those mistakes. Technically, they're flaws, but I think in the context of that style of the exploitation film, it makes sense and it works. Whereas, you know, Stanley Kubrick film or a Martin Scorsese film or more high level quality of a film or a higher level of a director, it's more blatantly obvious, and in that context it doesn't really work. So I'm like more critical of films like that in the typical Hollywood framework to a degree. So it's an interesting thing. So I find it hard to criticize some of these films to a degree because I know what it is and it already has those attributes. But anyway, very, very cool movie. Really excited to move on to some other movies, and I really had a blast covering all of these movies. So highly recommend The Ghost. Just a great movie. Easily one of the best in this entire collection. Super fun. 1963. The Italians were something else. They truly don't make movies like this anymore. So thanks again. This is Jason Dean, and we will see you next time. Peace.